Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in this first bit of material are membranes, and this really incorporates a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about. So what membranes are thin layers of tissue that we find in specific locations in the body. Specifically, membranes are going to cover the body surfaces, they're going to line body cavities, and they're also going to line organs. And what all of these membranes have in common is that they each consist of two types of tissue stacked on top of each other. First of all, we have an epithelial sheet, a superficial epithelial sheet, and then we have an underlying layer of connective tissue. And so this is just a generic diagram of a membrane. And here you can see we have a layer of epithelium, and the epithelium in this case happens to be simple columnar epithelium. And then immediately below that, we have a layer of connective tissue. So all these membranes that we're going to talk about, structurally speaking, have a superficial layer of epithelium and then an underlying layer of connective tissue. All right, so these are the three types of membranes that we find in the body. There are cutaneous membranes, mucous membranes, and serous membranes. And I'll just go through these briefly, but first of all, we have the cutaneous membranes. And the cutaneous membrane covers the body surface. It's the skin. So another term for the skin is the cutaneous membrane. It's that thin layer of tissue that covers and protects the body. And we already talked about that, or we're going to talk about that, and so I'll leave that for another time. Another type of membrane that we have in the body are called mucous membranes. Where do we find mucous membranes? Well, mucous membranes line body cavities that are open to the exterior. They line open body cavities. And here you can see the respiratory tract is an example of an open body cavity. So that's going to be lined with mucous membrane. And then lastly, we have what we call serous membranes. And these are a little more complicated, I guess, or just a little bit different to wrap your head around. But what serous membranes, where we find those, serous membranes are going to line closed body cavities. Cavities that are closed to the exterior, like the pleural cavities, for instance. And not only are they going to line those cavities, those internal cavities, but they're going to line the organs within those cavities as well. Now, something I want to point out here is that the cutaneous membrane is considered a dry membrane. And what that means is that at any given time, there's this membrane is dry. There's not going to be a layer of fluid over the top of it. Now, there's instances where you have sweat and oil on the top of it, but it's not a true layer of fluid that's there at all times. And so that's in contrast to mucous and serous membranes. Mucous and serous membranes are what we call wet membranes. And what that means is that at any given time, there's a layer of fluid lining that membrane. And there's different reasons why we have a layer of fluid in the mucous membranes and in the serous membranes. And we will get to that. So I'll just touch on the cutaneous membrane here, also called the skin. Again, the cutaneous membrane covers the body surface. It's the thin layer of tissue that covers the body surface. And this is the anatomy of the cutaneous membrane. So we have a layer of epithelium, and then underneath that we have actually two layers of connective tissue. And the specific epithelium that we find in the cutaneous membrane is this. What's that type of membrane, or that type of epithelium? Stratified squamous epithelium. And then underneath it we have layers of connective tissue, actually two layers of connective tissue. We have a layer of areolar tissue here, and then underneath it we have a layer of dense irregular connective tissue. But all of these details we're going to talk about in the integument lecture. Okay, so we'll start with mucous membranes here. And mucous membranes, first of all, can also be called the mucosa. If you hear the term mucosa, they're talking about a mucous membrane. So where do we find mucous membranes? First of all, mucous membranes line open body cavities. These are passageways that have external exposure. So what are some examples of these body cavities? Well, by now you know this. The digestive tract urinary tract, respiratory tract, reproductive tracts. These are all open body cavities, and so they're all lined with mucous membrane. Here we have the digestive tract, and this is a cavity that has external exposure both at the mouth and at the anus down there. So this whole thing is lined by mucous membrane. And what we're doing is we're looking at the small intestine here, and this is the lumen of the small intestine, and what you can see is that this layer of tissue that's lining the small intestine is the mucous membrane. And you can see there's a shine to it, a sheen to it, and that's because there's a layer of mucus there. It's a wet membrane, and that mucus represents the wet portion of that membrane. Now, why are we concerned about open body cavities? Why are we concerned about, having in the digestive tract, having this exposure at the mouth, at the anus? Well, this is a possible route for the entry of pathogens from the external environment. We're concerned about infection, the entry of pathogens. And so the mucosa has to be specialized to deal with that. So what does the mucosa do to combat that? And here we have a diagram of a mucous membrane. And what do you guys know? First of all, here's the epithelial sheet. What do you guys know about epithelium that prevents the entry of pathogens? Well, you have these tight junctions that are linking these epithelial cells together and preventing pathogens from getting into the body in between the cells. Those tight junctions prevent that. What's another thing? Well, shoot, this is a wet membrane. This is a mucous membrane. We're going to produce mucus. And here you can see here's a goblet cell, and it's producing this layer of mucus that lines the membrane. And what's that important for? Well, it's going to trap pathogens. And then the third thing that's going on here, and this is specifically in the underlying connective tissue, is we're going to have a heavy white blood cell presence. Okay, so one thing I want to point out here is that in all these mucous membranes, the epithelial type can differ. So the epithelium that we find here is simple columnar epithelium, but that's not always the case. The epithelium can be any of the types of epithelium, really, just depending on where it's at in the body. But something I want to point out is that the underlying connective tissue in all of these membranes is always areolar tissue. This is areolar tissue down here. And why is that the case? Why do we always have areolar tissue underneath epithelium? Well, areolar tissue is a loose connective tissue, so it has a nice blood supply. And so that's going to provide nice, good vascular support for the epithelium. This is a problem, though, or potential problem, having all this vasculature, all these blood vessels down in the areolar tissue, because this is also where pathogens in the lumen can first enter the blood supply. So if you have a bacteria that makes its way through there somehow and gets into the connective tissue, that's a problem because it can enter the blood supply in this areolar tissue, and then it has access to all different parts of the body. But the areolar tissue is just not going to let that happen. So what is it about the areolar tissue that is going to help in this regard, that's going to try to prevent pathogens from entering the blood supply? Well, if you remember about areolar tissue is a loose connective tissue. There's abundant ground substance in there. And what that allows for, allows for a heavy white blood cell presence. And so for those pathogens to get into the blood supply, they're going to have to go through the immune system first. One last thing I want to point out on this slide is that, because here you can see, here's the areolar tissue, but then you have this term lamina propria. Lamina propria is a special name given to the areolar tissue in the mucous membrane. So anytime you see a mucous membrane like this, and you're referring to this areolar tissue underneath the epithelium, we're going to call that the lamina propria. And I don't test you on that specifically, but I will use that term lamina propria, and I'm just referring to the areolar tissue component of the mucous membranes. All right, so as an example of these mucous membranes, let's look to the digestive tract. So this is what we call the digestive mucosa. Again, mucosa just refers to the mucous membrane. This is the mucous membrane in the digestive tract here. And if we were to look at histology of that, this is that right there. And first of all, here's the lumen, or the open space, and this is where food is going to travel down. And then let's identify some things here. Here's the epithelial component. And what type of epithelium are we dealing with there? We're dealing with simple columnar epithelium. Okay. And then underneath that simple columnar epithelium is the connective tissue. And that's what this is representing right there. That's the lamina propria down below. Okay, and then we have some figures right here that draw that out. Here we have our epithelium, our simple columnar epithelium, and then underneath that we have the lamina propria. And this is just showing all the kind of specific things that this mucous membrane is involved in. So first of all, what's going on here? We have food that's traveling down the small intestine, and we're concerned about these bacteria here that may have been brought in by the food getting access to the lamina propria, to the blood supply down there. So what are we going to do to stop that? Well, here we have our goblet cells, and these goblet cells are producing mucus. Actually, they produce a molecule called mucin that combines with water and forms mucus. But essentially, these goblet cells are forming this mucus layer. And it's interesting, there's actually two layers. There's an outer layer and an inner layer there. And so what's going on? Well, what's happening with these bacteria? They're getting trapped in this mucus layer here. Okay, so first of all, we trap those bacteria in that mucus layer. Then what's going on? Do we have any other, defenses for it? We do. Here you can see that you have an immune cell that's producing these antibodies, and these antibodies are now present in the mucus layer. You also have these cells here that are producing antimicrobial proteins. So you have the immune system producing these defenses that can try to attack these bacteria right away, before they even try to get inside the body. And that's what this is. It's the same diagram over here, just a kind of a different version of it. And we actually talk about some of these specifics in Biology 242 with the digestive tract. Here is the there's the simple columnar epithelium, and then everything below here is the lamina propria. So first of all, here you see the mucus layer that's being produced by these goblet cells, and it's trapping all those bacteria up there. And then this also shows that you have those antibodies and other antimicrobial proteins up here as well to try to take out those bacteria or pathogens. But down here in the lamina propria, what I want you to get an appreciation of, again, this is loose connective tissue. So there's a lot of space for the immune system. And you have all these immune system components there, all these white blood cells. You have macrophages. You have what we call these plasma cells. You have dendritic cells, B cells, T cells. These are all white blood cells that do specific things for the immune system. And what they're doing is they're all trying to prevent those bacteria from getting into the blood supply down here in the lamina propria. And on that note, I want to point out that there's more white blood cells in the gut than anywhere else in the body, specifically in this lamina propria area, because we're so concerned about these bacteria that can be present in food making its way and getting into the blood supply down there. Okay, so now we're up in the esophagus portion of the digestive tract, and there you go. There's the esophagus. So you chew food, you swallow it, it goes from the throat, and then it goes down into the esophagus. And this is histology of that right here. So this is pointing us out to it. This right there is the mucous membrane. And specifically, this is the epithelial component, and then this is the lamina propria underneath that. And then you get into these other layers called the submucosa and the muscularis layer. But for now, we're just concerned about this area right here. Now let's identify this epithelium that we have here. What's this epithelium that's lining the esophagus? That's stratified squamous epithelium. Why do we have stratified squamous epithelium in the esophagus? Well, because let's see. As food travels down the esophagus, there's going to be a lot of abrasion there. So this stratified squamous epithelium is great for protection. It's protecting these underlying tissues here because there's a lot of abrasion. There can be chemical damage, all sorts of stuff. Now, what do you notice about this stratified squamous epithelium there? Remember, this is a mucous membrane, and so we're going to have a layer of mucus on top of the esophagus there. But do you see any goblet cells in here? I don't see any goblet cells in there. These cells are just packed too tight for there to be any goblet cells in there. So where is this mucus going to come from? So here's the mucosal layer, and down below that is what we call the submucosa, and you have specifically these submucosal glands. And then that's what we're looking at here. So in the submucosa, the layer below the mucous membrane, we have these glands, and here's histology of them. What type of epithelium are we dealing with here? We're dealing with simple cuboidal epithelium. Simple cuboidal epithelium is going to produce this mucus, secrete it into this duct, and then that duct is going to travel through the mucus layer, and it's going to secrete that mucus on top of the stratified squamous epithelium there. So we know that this mucus layer is good for an immune role. It's going to trap those bacteria, but does it serve another role? It does. Okay, so as food is passing down the esophagus, this mucus is going to serve as lubrication. It's going to ease the passage of food, and it's going to cause less abrasion against the stratified squamous epithelium there. Here we are up in the oral mucosa. This is the mucous membrane in the mouth. And again, we have stratified squamous epithelium here for protection. And then here's the underlying connective tissue, this lamina propria. And all I want to point out here is give this a little relevance. But, there's such thing as sublingual medication. Sublingual medication is something you take under the tongue. And where do you want that medication to go? Okay, it's not a topical medication. We want that, well, it's applied topically, I guess, but we want that medication to actually get into the blood supply. So where's that going to happen at? So you take this medication, it's going to dissolve, has to be lipid soluble. Is it going to enter the blood in the stratified squamous epithelium? It's not. It has to go down there into the lamina propria to be able to reach this blood supply here. And that's the point I wanted to make here. Now let's look at some respiratory mucosa, the mucous membrane of the respiratory tract. And for most of the respiratory tract, this is what the mucous membrane looks like here. And this up here is our epithelial component. What type of epithelium is that? It looks like it could be stratified, but it's actually not. This is pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So it's pseudostratified. What else do we find in here? We have goblet cells. What else do we find in this pseudostratified columnar epithelium? We have cilia. Okay, so we have a lot of different components here. What's the connective tissue component? Areolar tissue. So this is all areolar tissue underneath here. Okay, this is another picture of the mucous membrane here, the respiratory mucosa. And, basically I want you to tell me what's going on. We just pointed out all those different components there, but what are they doing to help protect the respiratory mucosa from infection and from all that kind of stuff? And I want you to, in this explanation, I want you to incorporate goblet cells, mucus, pathogens, cilia, and basically I want you to give me an indication of what this respiratory mucosa is doing to help prevent these infections. Okay, and this is just another type of mucosa that we find in the body. This is the mucosa of the female reproductive tract, and specifically this is the mucosa that we find in the uterus and the mucosa that we find in the vagina. So remember, this is all open body cavity here, and specifically this is the vagina portion, and this is the mucous membrane for the vaginal portion. And then what happens in this diagram is that you get up here into the uterus. And so this is the mucous membrane in the uterus. And first of all, I want you guys to compare the epithelium here. What type of epithelium do we find in the vagina? What type of epithelium is that? That's stratified squamous epithelium, and that's for protection during sexual intercourse. Then, as you make your way to the uterus, what kind of epithelium do we have here? We have simple columnar epithelium. And what are simple columnar epithelium good at? They're good at secreting things, at absorbing things. And so we have different functions between the vagina and the uterus. If you look here, though, at the lamina propria in both the vagina and the uterus, you can see that, again, there's this heavy immune cell presence. There's a heavy white blood cell presence down there to prevent the entry of pathogens. And another thing that I wanted to point out is that, and we talk about this in Bio 242, but in the uterus here, the mucous membrane of the uterus undergoes dramatic changes as part of the menstrual cycle each month. And so there's dramatic physical changes that are going on with this uterine mucosa, and I'll show that on the next slide. And then another thing, endometriosis. What endometriosis is this is when tissue that's similar to this uterine mucosa here grows outside of the uterus. All right, so this is the uterine mucosa right there. This is the mucous membrane, and these are the changes that it goes through as part of the 28-day menstrual cycle. And then this shows the ovary and what's going on with the ovulation of an egg. And so what the uterus needs to do, the uterine mucosa, is it needs to prepare for a potential embryo to implant. So here's an egg being ovulated, and if it gets fertilized, then it's going to make its way down to the uterus, and it's going to implant in the embryo. And so this is the uterine mucosa at the beginning of the menstrual phase, and then over time, over that 28 days, it acquires glands, it becomes more vascular, all these things to help nourish a potential implanted embryo. And so that's just kind of the appreciation that I wanted to give you guys for that, all these changes that are going on in the uterine mucosa. It's a dynamic layer. All right, and then lastly we get to the serous membranes. And the serous membranes are also called the serosa, is another term you'll hear for it. And the serous membranes are unique in the fact that they're double-layered membranes. Okay, and also we're going to find the serous membranes. The serous membranes are going to line the walls of the body cavity. Specifically, they're going to line the walls of the ventral body cavity. So all of these cavities there are part of the ventral body cavity. So all of these cavities are going to be lined with serous membranes. And not only that, but the organs or the viscera that we find within each of those cavities is also going to be lined with a serous membrane. Okay, and there's three places that we're going to look at serous membranes. One of those serous membranes that we're going to look at is going to be lining the pleural cavities. So not only lining the pleural cavities, but the organs that we find within them, which are the lungs. Okay, and we're going to call these membranes the pleura. Another place that we're going to find serous membranes are lining the pericardial cavity there. And not only lining the pericardial cavity, but lining the heart within it. And that's called the pericardium. And then lastly, we're going to look at the serous membranes that line the abdominal cavity and also the digestive organs within it. And those serous membranes are called the peritoneum. So those are the three different serous membranes that we're going to look at. The pleura, lining the pleural cavity in the lungs, the pericardium, lining the pericardial cavity in the heart, and also the peritoneum, lining the abdominal cavity and the digestive organs within it. Okay, so let's take a look at these membranes specifically, and I want to talk about the naming, how you name these serous membranes. Okay, so first of all, here we have the pleural cavity, and so there's going to be a layer of serous membrane that lines the pleural cavity. Then there's also going to be a layer of serous membrane that lines the lungs within the pleural cavity. And each of those has a specific name. So the layer of the membrane, so out of these two layers here, the layer of the membrane that actually lines the cavity is going to be called the parietal layer. And the layer of the membrane that's going to line the organs within that cavity is going to be called the visceral layer. Okay. So how are we going to name these two serous membranes? The serous membrane that's going to line the pleural cavity is going to be called the parietal pleura. It's going to be called parietal because that's the name that we give to the membrane that lines the cavity, and the pleura is referring to the cavity that we find it in. So that's called the parietal pleura. And then we have this other layer of membrane that actually lines the lung. And the layer of the serous membrane that lines the actual organ is called the visceral layer. So this is going to be called the visceral pleura. Visceral because it's lining the organ, pleura because it's in the pleural cavities. Something else that I want to point out here is that there's a thin slit-like cavity that's formed between these two membranes. So if you look up close here, these two membranes, there's a little space in between them. And that space is called the serous cavity. And what functions do you think this, then this serous cavity is filled with serous fluid. So you have this space in between the membranes, and that space is filled with serous fluid. Now, what functions do you think that serous fluid is there for? I realize I don't have this opened up here, but you guys can guess. One is it's going to be lubrication. So those lungs inflate and they deflate, and so there's a lot of friction in there, and so it's going to cause lubrication. Is going to be the main purpose of that serous fluid. And here's a kind of a better picture of these two layers that are lining the lungs. Here's the serous membrane that lines the pleural cavity. That's called the parietal pleura. Here's the layer of the serous membrane that actually lines the lungs. That's called the visceral pleura. And again, there's a small space in between called the serous cavity, and that's filled with serous fluid. And that's going to prevent these two membranes from rubbing against each other. Okay, so these serous membranes, just like all other membranes, have an epithelial component and they have a connective tissue component. And so what we're looking at here, this is the parietal pleura component. And this is the underlying connective tissue. That's the lamina propria, which makes this the epithelium on top of it. Now, what type of epithelium does that look like? It's not column-shaped, it's not cube-shaped, it's squamous-shaped. And so the epithelial component of all serous membranes is simple squamous epithelium. And that's what this is representing here. This is representing simple squamous epithelium, and then you have a layer of areolar tissue underneath it, and then this is where we find that serous fluid in that serous cavity. And there is a special name given to the simple squamous epithelium of these serous membranes, and that's mesothelium. And you may have heard that term before. Where have you guys heard that? Mesothelioma. Okay? And so what's happening with mesothelioma is that it's a type of cancer of this mesothelium, and the people who worked in asbestos mines and really had exposure to these fine respiratory particles. Asbestos, for instance, what happens is that you breathe in that asbestos and it goes into the lungs, and it's really sharp and it pokes its way through the lungs, and eventually it gets out here to this mesothelium, and it irritates that mesothelium, and it can mutate it, and it can cause cancer of those cells. And so that's what mesothelium is referring to. It's referring to cancer of the simple squamous epithelium that we find in these serous membranes. Now let's look in the heart. And the serous membranes lining the heart are called the pericardium. So specifically, here's the heart, and we have one layer of the serous membrane lining the heart. What's that going to be called? Well, the layer that lines the organ is called visceral. So it's the visceral pericardium. And then we have a layer that lines the pericardial cavity, and we give that term parietal because it's lining the cavity. So that's the parietal pericardium. Visceral pericardium and parietal pericardium. And then here's that serous fluid in between them. And again, why do we need this serous fluid in between them? Because the heart contracts and it relaxes, and these two membranes have the potential to rub against each other, and that serous fluid prevents that. Okay, what we're showing here, this is the pericardium, and the pericardium is actually formed by this tough pericardial sac, and that's what we're looking at right here. We have a tough pericardial sac, and then inside that sac we have the heart. And so what they did here is they cut into the pericardial sac and reflected it. Now why do I bring that up? Because one layer of that serous membrane is lining the inside of this pericardial sac, and that's the parietal pericardium. That thin layer of tissue lining the sac is the parietal pericardium. Then you have another thin layer of tissue that's actually lining the heart. It's the outer layer of the heart. And what layer of the membrane is that going to be? That's going to be the visceral pericardium. You can actually see that a little better on this page here. Here's the heart, and you can see that shiny layer there. And that shiny outer layer is the visceral pericardium. And it's shiny because there's a little bit of mucus on it, there's a little bit of serous fluid on it. It's a wet membrane there. Okay, and then lastly we have the peritoneum, or the peritoneal membranes. And these are the membranes that are going to line the abdominal cavity and also the digestive organs within that abdominal cavity. And so the layer of the serous membrane that actually lines the abdominal cavity is called the parietal peritoneum. And that's what this is showing here. This layer of membrane that's lining the entire abdominal cavity there is the parietal peritoneum. Then the layer lining the actual abdominal organs is called the visceral peritoneum. And these are the intestines, for instance, and all of these intestines are lined by visceral peritoneum. And then there's this space in between that we call the peritoneal cavity. Okay. And there can be pathology related to all of these serous membranes. Peritonitis is inflammation of these peritoneal membranes right there, and it can be really painful. Okay. And then just lastly, I guess you may hear the term retroperitoneal. So this is This is a cross section, and this is a inferior view, I guess, and this is anterior up there, this is posterior, there's the spine, and this is all the peritoneum, the abdominal cavity up there with all the abdominal organs. And so something you'll hear is the term retroperitoneal, and what that means is retroperitoneal means it's behind the peritoneal membranes, and a good example of that are the kidneys. The kidneys are located in a retroperitoneal position behind the peritoneal cavity in there. All right.